Welcome to the Digital Responsibility Podcast. There is a vibrant community around the world exploring how we drive forward digital innovation, products and services, and generally exploit technology progression for the sustained benefit of society and the planet. On this podcast, you will hear from me, Christopher Johnson, and Rob Price, two of the original founders of Corporate Digital Responsibility, as we speak to our guests to hear their stories and piece together what it means to be responsible in the digital age. If you'd like to learn more, take a look at the website, corporatedigitalresponsibility.net.
Welcome to episode 8 of the 5th season of Digital Responsibility Podcast. And tonight I'm delighted to be joined by Eleanor Harry. And Eleanor, fascinating conversation ahead, I hope, around the work that you're doing. Would you like to introduce yourself? Tell everyone who you are.
Thanks so much, Rob, for having me. It's an absolute pleasure. So yes, as you said, my name is Eleanor Harry and I'm the CEO and founder of a company called HACE. We're based in Manchester, in case anyone wants to come and visit, first of all. And we essentially, our company focuses, our sole mission is to sustainably eradicate child labour in global supply chains. As a brief background of child labour, there's currently 160 million children in child labour today. That equates to 1 in 10 children globally. 70% of that child labour is in agriculture, so right at the bottom of the supply chain. I've been working with or in this industry for about 13 years from a fashion supply chain background, which is how we traditionally kind of associated child labour with this specific industry. But I've worked across a multiple range of agricultural commodities as well, so cotton, fishing, tanzanite, gold, coffee, cocoa, tobacco, tea. The list kind of goes on and on. So yeah, that's a little bit of my background.
And I love the bit kind of we're in Manchester, come and visit. We're just trying to eradicate global child labour. I mean, you've gone for the little problem to start with, then.
The problem of being in Manchester where none of our clients are. Do you know what we love being in Manchester because it's a really amazing data and tech and certainly AI scene up here, and it's not a laughing matter at all. But we're based in an old warehouse, as lots of tech companies are in Manchester, and it's an old cotton mill. So we say this is really where child labour was. So we sat in a building where there was loads of child labour, because we kind of tend to forget that it was only 100 years ago where child labour was made illegal in this country. So
tell me a bit about how you said there that you had a background in fashion, clothing, etc. But there's still a big step to go from I'm going to leave what I'm doing there to focus on this massive global problem. And I should introduce from a CDR point of view. I mean, the thing for me, we talk about innovating to solve the world's biggest problems, whether they're environmental or whether they're societal. So it's a brilliant example of that. But it also touches on so many of the other principles. But how did that come to be? It feels like a conversation in a pub one day that you suddenly kind of said, I've got this great idea, but what's the reality?
You know what? You're not actually that wrong. But it was over wine in Malta. Essentially, kind of, I was, from a fashion background originally. And it's a pretty, let me try and be diplomatic here. It's not the best industry to work in on any side of the value chain, where you are, if you're a cotton farmer in Uzbekistan, all the way through to probably head office somewhere in Paris. But essentially, I think that I always needed more from fashion than what it was giving me. So I specialised in my undergraduate a long time ago in ethical fashion, as it was called then. And I decided to kind of leave the fashion supply chain and started working for an NGO. And the first project I was put on, interestingly, I just said that was state-imposed child labour in the cotton industry in Uzbekistan. And this was back in 2010. And I clearly remember this being the worst thing that I'd ever heard. I grew up above nurseries in Stockport, outside of Manchester. So I'd been around children all of my life. And I guess seeing 5-year-old children picking cotton and not being in school, I just thought, how can this be? And unfortunately, it's still the same today, not just in Uzbekistan, but everywhere. So, yeah, I mean, the motivation for starting HACE was always scale. Because working for an NGO, you can reach 100, maybe 1,000 children if you're lucky. But we're talking about one of the biggest, most complex societal problems of our time. There's nothing really that unites global children other than hunger, than child labor. And that is really global. It's not just in kind of South Asia, it's in the US, it's in the UK. Child labor is in every country, in every supply chain. So I was frustrated about scale, and I didn't know really that much about data. I knew kind of statistical methodologies and other various bits and pieces, but it really did come from a wine in Malta, thinking how can I create something at scale? And I knew that data was the key to unlock that scale. And I knew that technology was, but you need data in order to feed technology, and then kind of all the way up and down. And eventually we kind of started, and it was brilliant. And then we really quickly moved into artificial intelligence, because that was the only way that we could get the data and extract the data that powered our data sets. And we actually steered quite clear of kind of some other things. And yeah, that's how it started, I guess.
I remember a conversation I had with a guy called David Jensen at the UN Environment Programme about 3 years ago, and we were talking about digital transformation of the planet. And he said, kind of, well, there were almost 3 steps to it. It was, how do you work out how to aggregate all of the data sources that are relevant to the environment or climate change or anything else? How do you then build an ecosystem that can utilize that data to solve those biggest problems, and thereby drive change, transformation, outcomes that are different? So you started on the journey of aggregating the data, and I'm kind of intrigued kind of where you'd even start on that in terms of the vast kind of complexity of it. But then, of course, the critical thing is what you do with that data and what others do with that data and how people react. I have a feeling that maybe people only really react when they are faced with information in the depths of their supply chain that is just untenable for them. Tell me a bit more about it in terms of how do we change? How do we drive transformation using what you're doing? Expand a bit on what you are doing. Tell us about the index.
Yeah, I mean, I really agree with you about the education part. So if I start a little bit further behind the index, we started essentially, yes, we could probably talk for at least 3 hours over 3 bottles of wine on lack of standardization in the data that's available on a variety of sustainability issues, which is how we started, really. A whole other story. So we really started as a service-based or tech-enabled consultancy. How we delivered was via consultancy, working with kind of big FMCG agribusiness clients to understand the root causes of child labour within their supply chains by using data. And it works to a certain extent, but you're absolutely right. Sometimes it falls on deaf ears. Like, great, I understand what's driving child labour in my supply chain, but then you have to hand over that responsibility to a company. Whether they want to or want to not do it is up to them. So, and really the whole issue with child labour is we tend to kind of focus on solutions rather than understanding the problem itself. That's always the case. Like, let me try and find a quick, easy solution to solving child labour. We have to take one step back and understand the problem itself. And I've seen that over a decade is we can't rush into solutions. So what we really saw with the services side of the kind of consultancy side of the business was we were speaking to, global 500 clients that were saying to us, yeah, we know we've got an issue with child labour in our supply chain. We know we have it, but it's more of a 2025 issue for us. So you think, so you know that it's an issue, but you're not willing to move on it for another 3 years. Bearing in mind the Sustainable Development Goal for ending child labour in all its forms is 2025. So the fact that companies are moving after the Sustainable Development Goal says something. And again, because it's not prioritised necessarily in an ESG agenda, and I think that's more about an education piece. So this kind of led us down the road of, okay, well, if companies aren't moving on child labour, then who are the only stakeholders that are going to force them to do that? So you have this light bulb moment of, well, they're shareholders. Everyone's accountable to shareholders. Profit. margin is driven by shareholders, or so we think, and it is true. So CEOs and C-suites of most publicly listed companies are beholden to their shareholders. They own them. Sorry, we own them with our pension funds and then et cetera, et cetera. So we thought, we are not including the investor community in the fight to eradicate child labour in supply chains. And they're the only ones that those companies are going to listen to. They don't listen to me. He sat in Manchester in a mill, even though I've been working in this industry for, a long time and sit on various different UN boards and, not going to listen to me. Great. And this is how the idea of the Child Labour Index was born. So we thought, how do we create a quantitative metric on child labour performance at a company and group level? How do we do that? And how do we scale that? And how do we automate that? And how do we leverage the power of data and AI to do that? And essentially, how do we sell that to their investors? And how do we sell it to their asset managers and the pension funds that invest in them? And that's what we've done. So we have created that product in a variety of different ways using, I can talk about data forever and ever, and how we use kind of data and AI to power the index. But essentially, yeah, we generate the only quantitative metric on every single publicly listed company in the world on child labour performance.
And there's, again, brilliant parallel with kind of some of the work around CDR. I often talk around why should organisations care around digital responsibility, and come back to, well, probably 3 points, but two of the most important are reputational damage, which clearly kind of is relevant in this context as well, especially when that information is made publicly available, and people are making kind of decisions about what they buy or not buy around that. And then the second one is, as you say, it's investor kind of related. It's access to money, I often talk about the work that Ethos do in Switzerland. And they've published CDR indexes and a benchmark in the top Swiss businesses around CDR for similar reasons. They have an involvement in the management of the pension funds of the top 200 Swiss businesses. So people listen to them, and it's that's your point, isn't it? It's kind of, you got to find the people who have a fundamental voice to therefore have influence in change. But I'm really interested in another point around that change, because it's not as simple, I would imagine, as saying, stop doing that. Because
Absolutely
it's
not.
more complex. And whether it's in Uzbekistan or in any other country around the world, you've got to then think about the fabric of how that country operates, those families operate. I guess I'm interested in the consequential kind of transformation. So let's imagine those investors have got that index. What happens then? And maybe, I mean, if there are illustrated stories or case studies that you've seen, whether it relates to the index or just organizations doing something positive around that space, what would you highlight?
So maybe I can give one specifically around child labour that may shed some light on what could happen in a negative light, and then I can potentially say how the index would interfere with this kind of negative, what happened here. So very recently, in December last year to January this year, a Blackstone, who are one of the biggest asset managers in the world, they owned a company called PSSI, who are a sanitation company. And the US Department of Labor and Reuters discovered or uncovered the fact that the sanitation company PSSI had hundreds, if not thousands, of children working cleaning meat processing factories in the United States overnight in hazardous conditions, 12, 13, 14-year-olds there. It's a huge case in itself, and you can find it, and you can find some stories on our website and the way that we talk about it. So, of course, as soon as a child labour scandal happens, there is nothing that tanks a share price like a child labour scandal. Nothing. Like, very little else in ESG can really do that, because especially in the US, like this is US child labour in the US. So, what were the repercussions of what happened here? Well, certainly Blackstone didn't know that this was happening. An asset manager has a responsibility to know what happens in their portfolio companies, but they don't know how to ask the right questions. What happened to PSSI? CEO was fired. They got fined $11 million, which seems nothing, but worse is the company lost 2 of their biggest contracts. But the pension fund that was investing, that obviously handed over those assets to Blackstone to invest, also wrote an open letter to Blackstone saying, what are you doing about monitoring child labour in your portfolio companies that we are giving you money to invest in? Question mark. What are they going to say? We're not monitoring this issue. So we couldn't have had a meaningful conversation with that CEO. We couldn't have picked up the phone to that CEO and says, I heard there's a kind of rumblings around child labour in the US. Are you sure that everything's okay with your supply chain? And even if that CEO says yes, it's like, prove it to me as your investor that you're doing something about it. So if we take something like an index, and it's the same with lots of other, kind of ESG indexes, more for specialized indexing like ours, is the index enables that meaningful conversation to be had. It's not just a score that says you're performing really badly and asset managers beware of this company or divest your money. That's the worst thing that could happen. And I'll tell why it's the worst thing that could happen. But what it does is it allows that asset manager and investor to have the meaningful conversation with the C-suite of that company and says, I see you're performing pretty badly in child labour. What are you doing about it? And if your investor says that to a CEO, can you imagine the trickle-down effect that it has into frontline? So are we auditing properly? What are we deploying? How much resource are we deploying into this area? Who's responsible for this data collection? And these questions are the first types of questions that need to be asked if we are ever going to start thinking about putting more resources from a company perspective into something like child labour. So I think that there's a lot around the education piece of this is a very big issue within ESG that companies have to move on, not just from a legislative perspective. So we go for a top-down approach, and our measure of impact is how many asset managers pick up the phone to the CEOs that are performing badly, and what are the CEOs providing back. And once CEO is aware of something, it usually gets pushed down. You must have seen it a million times in companies, and it's the only way that we can really influence. It's difficult for us to get to 160 million children, and we are not and will never encourage divestment out of companies because they're performing badly. Equally, we will never, ever, ever, ever encourage companies to pull out of suppliers or cut contracts with suppliers because there is child labour within it, because those children just go and work somewhere else. It's about having that meaningful contribution to those communities and those societies where that supply chain is touching. And that's about optimization of resources. That's about using data. And there are plenty of kind of publicly listed companies that are pumping a lot, billions of dollars into eradicating child labour in communities. And that's what it is. It's not cutting or divesting or trying to move the problem somewhere else. It's about having a tool that enables companies and investors to see, how am I performing and what am I going to do about it?
In a sense, it's transparency in action because things are visible. A number of questions kind of come to mind from that, but let me start with, how do you know it's right? So how do you verify and validate the data that's aggregated? Because of course, with any index, and we see it with ESG, don't we? I mean, there are parts of society and business that are kind of doing their best to pull apart the ESG measurement and indexes. How do you have the greatest faith that at any particular point in time, the information that you're representing is as good as it can be?
It's a great question, and you're absolutely right about ESG ratings or any sort of judgment on the data. So ESG ratings and indexing is about to become regulated by the FCA, which we totally approve of. We've kind of always followed a transparency as key part of our methodology. We release quite a lot publicly about our methodology, so it's really clear. We don't use any synthetic or estimated data. So that's the first one. So we're not pretending that if data is absent, we're not trying to fill it with something, which is where you start getting all of the judgments, if it's based on synthetic or estimated data, start to become a little tricky. We build, again, kind of thinking about transparency, which I think is key to testing if the data is right or having confidence in it, is being able to trace it back to its source. So because we are AI powered, we also build a knowledge graph database, which is really important for the traceability. So at any given time, if anyone questioned a score, we can pull every single piece of data that was associated to that company. And essentially, the difference between us and kind of other ESG ratings is, yes, it's AI, but it means that our scores are updated every 24 hours, and it means it's an automated judgment on the data rather than a human necessarily based judgment on the data, which is how we're enabled to scale. So of course, the judgments or subjectivity on the data are very few when it comes to us. Really, our complex processes is actually processing the data and being able to associate companies to certain pieces of data, which is why Knowledge Graph helps us so much. But essentially, the main judgments that we make on the data is around one of our algorithms, which we call company disclosure. And essentially, it's a governance metric of using all of these publicly available documentation from a company website that we scrape. Are they identifying child labor as an issue in their supply chain? Do they have it in a supplier code of conduct? Are they following international best practice? Are they even if they say they are they well equipped to be able to deal with that? So essentially, it's like a child labor expert reading through a document saying, that's pretty good. That's a pretty good example. And then we test against kind of good and bad examples. And, there's lots of A/B testing of what we do. So this is the main judgment that we make on the data. And we do have industry experts around us. And of course, it's our subject matter expertise as a team. Like, we have many, many years of combined experience in this area. So what we would particularly be looking for. So I guess when it comes to kind of subjectivity of the scores, how do we know that they're right? Well, they're also, it's one main subjectivity on those scores, and it kind of sits there. So we're comfortable with it. We also do lots of testing around kind of ground truth. So we do have validation techniques. We kind of use ground truth methods and then expert methods, which are the two kind of main ways of validating. So our ground truth is we do a lot of kind of human sampling and human in the loop as well, to make sure that we're not only picking up the right data that we need to, we're also making sure that we're picking up all of the data that we need to that's related to a certain topic. So I don't know, do we know that it's always right? Well, is anything always right? It's probably just trying to have the most justifiable methodology and being very transparent with it, and knowing that we've got the right validation techniques and a human in the loop that can verify if needed.
Yeah, and I think, again, going back to the CDR principles, Principle 4 talks about third-party data and algorithms, and transparency and authenticity are kind of the key thing. It's about having a process in place. You can't always guarantee that some things is right, but as long as you've got feedback loops, then of course organizations have always got that visibility to be able to go, hang on a minute, kind of it's not picked up this or that, and come back and that iterative and daily updates, as you say. I think one of the things that I've always been interested in is it's one thing for an organization to say something, but it's another thing for employees within that organization to recognize that that's actually executed and done, and therefore to have an employee view as much as a organizational view kind of has always been an interesting contrast with me. But tell me a bit more about where the index is then. So I think last time we spoke about this earlier in the year, you were kind of looking to launch around now, actually. So is it out there, and are people? Well, I mean, you talked about investors population earlier, but is it investors or will it be public as well eventually?
So it's not now. It's we're launching formally in the market in Q1, but Q4 this year we are selecting a discrete number of credible asset managers in the sustainable investment space to, throughout Q4, give feedback on the child labour index, as well as kind of other industry experts giving feedback on certain judgments in the data. So we're at the moment we're speaking and organising the kind of feedback sessions for that discrete number of asset managers globally, and then we hope to launch in the market in Q1, with asset managers being our main target market, but also asset owners, asset consultants, professional services, banks, and other financial institutions. Companies themselves can also access the index. So the publicly listed company can also access the index, and they also have the opportunity to provide us with extra pieces of private disclosure in a secure portal so we can process that to make their score more accurate and reflect exactly what they're doing internally. Because we totally understand, and I've seen it because I've worked in companies and we've worked with companies, that not everything that's on their website is public, and it's not fair for us to be making judgments on them without giving the opportunity to disclose extra pieces of information. So that comes a little bit later down the line for us. Yeah, so absolutely, there'll be certain parts of the index that will be publicly available, but it won't be from a company name perspective. It will be more like sector aggregations. So we can see how sectors are performing against each other. We can see how subsectors are performing against each other from 3 different algorithmic perspectives. So which sectors are most negatively perceived by the public when it comes to child labour versus which really are the worst performers in a governance measure when it comes to child labour. So yeah, absolutely. From a sector perspective, we plan very much to be releasing aggregated parts of it.
I'm now intrigued, of course, to know, and it might be too early. Maybe I need to come back in 6 months and ask you the question. Any surprises in terms of how the sectors are playing out in terms of that early data?
You have the same old offenders right at the top. So sometimes you think, wow, I can't believe that company has no governance metrics at all on this issue. It's shocking. You think, how is a company your size with a vast supply chain barely mentioning this issue on any piece of documentation that's public? And that is worrying. It's worrying for them, but it's also worrying for consumers buying from these companies. So, as you know, with defamation, etc., we can't release any kind of public information. But there's been some surprises, a lot around the governance, public perception less so. So that's one of our algorithms of essentially how it measures how negatively a company is associated in the media with child labour, and they're usually the kind of offenders, the ones that people say. So it's quite, these are algorithms that are quite easy to validate, or easier to validate, because if I ask 100 people in this building, tell me a company when I say child labour, they say very much a mixture of 5 companies, and yes, they usually are the kind of worst performers. Our other algorithm is supply chain. So it's essentially a generic subsector score on the risk of exposure, or how susceptible that supply chain is to child labour, and then a company is attached to that sector. So it's a generic subsector risk. When you start adding supply chain on top of supply chain on top of supply chain, very complex supply chains, that supply chain risk grows exponentially.
And I can guarantee there will just won't be the visibility in those organisations. I mean, cascaded supply chains. It's the same in terms of if we're talking about data or AI risks in that sense. That's where it's buried, because kind of they just won't know. There isn't that degree of granularity of check. So it must be quite exciting times kind of leading up to that launch. How do you hope everyone will react? So what are your hopes for launch? Because it's a sensitive topic, isn't it? I mean, you will get lots of plaudits in terms of what you're doing, and then there'll be some people that are horrified by what you're doing.
Yes. I think that if we achieve both of those things, we've probably done something. I think I said this from the beginning. So our mission as a company is, and will always be, and has always been, to sustainably eradicate child labour in global supply chains. How we do that is you can do that in hundreds of different ways. So I'm absolutely certain that there will be people that would be annoyed with what we're doing, but we have to start somewhere. And I genuinely believe that for companies themselves, if they don't know how they're performing, and then investors don't know how companies are performing, then we don't have anything to base it on. And if you think about kind of natural, I guess I don't really like saying human nature, but it's kind of more animal nature, mammal nature, is we want to do well. So it's a kind of classic at school where you want to get 10 out of 10. And if we can start those types of conversations, then I think that we're doing a good job in making child labour more known and prioritising that within the ESG agenda. So back to our kind of mission statement, if we're starting to prioritise child labour, not just climate or environmental. I mean, look at biodiversity gets left right at the bottom, and it's so important. And now it's kind of rising up through the ranks in the kind of environmental side. We expect and hope that child labour will be exactly the same. Like, we cannot go any longer ignoring this issue globally, because 1 in 10 children is the future workforce of this world. They're not, when you're a child, when you turn from 17 to 18, if you're a child labourer, it doesn't just disappear. You become the future of the world's workforce. So if we're not tackling it then, it's like, when? Well, if it's 2025, why is it not now? So, I hope that there will be a kind of mixed reaction, but I do, of course, hope that people will understand, certainly investors will, and our customers will understand the value in the data point that we're providing, the fact that there's no other data point in the market. There is, so if they're not kind of moving on child labour here, it's like, how are they getting those other data points in? And yeah, we hope for the best, but if we can make some noise around child labour and make companies and investors understand this issue a little bit more, then I think that I've done basically my life's work, hopefully.
Cool. And
but I assume I'll be here for a long time, because I've been talking about this for 13 years and people tend not to, So.
But there's such an important point. Biodiversity was the conversation in the last podcast last week, so good reference. With all of these things, they are big meaty challenges that kind of people can look at and go, that's just too hard. Let's do that in 2025, as you said earlier. But we've got to start with them somewhere. So it's just brilliant that you're going, I'm going to try and innovate and use technology and use data to shine a light on something that needs to change. And I can't fix it on my own tomorrow, but at least I'll start doing something that will kind of get other people on board, wanting to kind of make that difference. So look, the first time we talked about it, I loved your passion for the subject. So thanks for bringing that passion to the conversation tonight. And maybe we should come back in 9 months and kind of see how it's going, and kind of see some of the stories in terms of how people have reacted, because I think the key to the success is going to be what happens next in terms of the transformations, both societal and corporate, once that information is actually seen. So thank you, Eleanor, for coming to talk to us tonight.
Thank you. Honestly, I really appreciate it.